The stars had always been quiet for humanity. For thousands of years, people looked up at the night sky and wondered if someone was looking back. In 2187, they finally got their answer. Someone was looking. They just did not care. Humanity had taken its first real steps into the galaxy only 12 years earlier. A scientist named Dr. Annika Feld had cracked the secret of faster-than-light travel with a device called the Rift Engine. It was ugly. It was unstable. It shook the walls of any ship that used it. But it worked. And within a decade, humanity had built 3 small colonies on planets orbiting distant stars. The largest was called New Svalbard. It sat in a green valley on a cold world, and over 1 million people called it home. Families, workers, teachers, children who had never seen Earth but knew its stories. What humanity did not know was that the galaxy was already full. Over 4,000 species had formed an ancient alliance called the Galactic Concord. Some of these species were millions of years old. They had mapped every corner of the galaxy, built cities around dying stars, and created technology that would look like magic to human eyes. They had watched humanity's first clumsy steps into space the way a person might watch an ant crawl across a sidewalk. They noticed. They did not care. The Concord had rules, or at least it pretended to. In truth, the only rule that mattered was power. If a species was strong, it was respected. If it was weak, it was ignored. And if it was very weak and very unlucky, it was consumed. The Velkari Dominion was the mouth that did the consuming. They were a warrior species, tall and armored with natural bone plating across their bodies. Their empire stretched across 300 star systems, all of them taken by force from species too small to fight back. The Conquered tolerated the Velkari because they were useful. When a border needed to be enforced or a rebellious species needed to be crushed, the Velkari were happy to do the work. In return, the Conquered looked the other way when the Dominion swallowed another young civilization whole. Humanity was next on the menu. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning, colony time. Governor Elena Vasquez was drinking coffee in her office when her communication officer burst through the door, pale and shaking. 200 Velkari warships had dropped out of faster-than-light travel directly above New Svalbard. They filled the sky like a dark cloud. Each one was the size of a small city, covered in weapon arrays that glowed a dull red. They hung in orbit and said nothing for 6 hours. The silence was worse than any threat. Then the message came. A single transmission, broadcast on every frequency. It was in the Velkari language, which no human understood at the time. It took 3 hours to decode. When they finally translated it, Vasquez read the words and felt her stomach drop. Vacate or be composted. Vasquez was not a soldier. She was an administrator, a woman who had spent her career building things. She had no warships. Earth had no warships. Humanity had never needed them. She looked at the 200 weapons pointed at her world and made the only decision she could. She ordered an evacuation. It was chaos. Over 1 million people trying to get on transport ships that were never designed for this. Families were separated in the crowds. Parents carried children on their shoulders. Old people were loaded onto medical ships. The transport captains pushed their engines beyond safe limits, trying to get as many people off the surface as possible. In 12 hours, they managed to load almost 400,000 people onto ships and begin launching them toward orbit. The Velkari waited until the transports were in open space. Then they opened fire. It was not a battle. There was no resistance to overcome. The transport ships had no weapons and no shields. They were tin cans full of human beings floating in the black. The Velkari cut through them like a blade through paper. Ship after ship exploded in flashes of white light. Each flash was 100 lives, 200, 300, families holding each other in the dark as the walls came apart around them. The medical ships were marked with bright green crosses, a universal signal even among conquered species that meant, "Do not fire." The Velkari fired anyway. One medical ship carried 400 children under the age of 10, evacuated from a school in the colony's northern district. The ship's name was the Gentle Dawn. It burned for 11 minutes before it broke apart. On the surface, the Valkyrie bombarded the remaining settlements. Buildings that had taken years to construct were turned to ash in seconds. The valley where New Svalbard had been built became a blackened scar. The rivers boiled. The forests burned. In 9 hours, over 800,000 human beings were dead. Governor Vasquez survived. She had been on one of the last transports to launch, and her pilot had managed to slip past the Valkyrie line by flying through the debris field of destroyed ships. She arrived at Earth 4 days later, still wearing the same clothes, still carrying a coffee mug she had grabbed without thinking as she ran from her office. She could not stop shaking. Earth sent a formal protest to the Galactic Concord. It was the first official communication between humanity and the wider galaxy. The response came from a Concord diplomat, a tall insectoid creature named Envoy Shathais. Shathais met with Earth's ambassador, Ravat Chandrasekharan, in a sterile white chamber at a Concord outpost. Shathais looked at the ambassador with compound eyes that showed nothing resembling sympathy. "This is the natural order," Shathais said. "The weak are consumed. You should be grateful they left your homeworld intact. Many species are not so fortunate." Ambassador Chandrasekharan stared at the diplomat for a long time. Then she smiled politely, thanked Shathais for the meeting, and left. Back on Earth, the footage from New Svalbard had been broadcast on every screen in every city in every country. The world watched the gentle dawn burn. The world watched children reach for their parents in corridors filled with fire. The world watched, and the world went quiet in a way it had never been quiet before. Not the quiet of defeat, the quiet of a decision being made. The United Nations Emergency Council met in a sealed chamber beneath Geneva. Every world leader attended, either in person or by secure link. The room was dark except for a single screen that showed the final transmission from New Svalbard, a colony worker named David Park, holding his infant son, looking into the camera and saying, "Tell them we were here. Tell them our names." The screen went black. Secretary General Idris Okonkwo sat at the head of the table. He was a calm man, a patient man. He had spent his career building bridges between nations. He looked around the room at the faces of every leader on Earth and saw the same thing in all of them. It was not fear. It was not sadness. It was something older and colder and far more dangerous. "How long do we need?" Okonkwo asked. General Lion Joe, the head of a newly formed joint military command, answered without hesitation. 10 years, minimum." "You have 5, Okonkwo said. No one in the room argued. No one asked why. Everyone understood. 800,000 people had names and the galaxy had shrugged. That was going to be the last time the galaxy shrugged at anything. The galaxy forgot about humanity almost immediately. That was the plan. In the weeks following the massacre at New Svalbard, Earth shut down. All interstellar communication channels were closed. The 2 surviving human colonies, small outposts with barely 50,000 people between them, were quietly evacuated back to the Sol system. Cargo ships that once carried supplies to distant worlds were recalled. Research stations went dark. Relay beacons were switched off one by one, like lights going out in a house. To the galaxy, it looked like a species dying. The Galactic Concord updated its records. An analyst from the Menhara species, a very old and very scholarly civilization, wrote a short note in humanity's file. Species 4417. Post-traumatic societal collapse likely. Expected extinction window, 50 to 200 years. No further monitoring recommended. The file was closed. The Valkyrie Dominion did not even bother to update their records. To them, humanity was already gone. A footnote. One more name on a very long list of species that had learned their place in the universe the hard way. The Valkyrie celebrated their easy victory and turned their attention to the next target, a peaceful aquatic species in a neighboring sector that had recently discovered radio waves. Nobody was watching Earth. That was the biggest mistake the galaxy had ever made. Behind the silence, behind the closed channels and the dark relay beacons, every human being on the planet was working. Not some of them, all of them. The project had no official public name at first, but the people who built it called it Prometheus, after the old Greek myth of the one who stole fire from the gods. It was a fitting name. Humanity was about to steal something much more dangerous than fire. Secretary-General Okonkwo signed the Unity Mandate 3 weeks after the Emergency Council meeting. It was the first document in human history signed by every nation on Earth simultaneously. Old rivalries were put aside. Old borders became meaningless. Countries that had spent centuries arguing over patches of land now shared their best scientists, their deepest secrets, their most advanced research without hesitation. The mandate was simple. Every resource, every mind, every factory, every laboratory on Earth was now pointed at one goal. Humanity would never be helpless again. General Lion Zhou ran the military side of Prometheus from a command center built 2 kilometers beneath the Himalayas. She was a small woman with a sharp face and eyes that never seemed to blink. She had lost her nephew on New Svalbard. He was 19 years old. He had gone to the colony to study geology. She kept his last message on her personal device and read it every morning before work. It said, "The rocks here are amazing, Auntie. You would love it." She read it, put the device away, and then spent the next 16 hours designing weapons that would make the galaxy tremble. The breakthroughs came fast, because desperation is the mother of genius. First came the Ghost Doctrine. When the Valkyrie attacked New Svalbard, their ships had left behind debris, pieces of hull plating, broken sensor arrays, fragments of shield generators. Salvage teams had collected every scrap before the evacuation was complete. Earth's scientists studied this alien technology not to copy it, but to understand its weaknesses. Within 18 months, they had developed a stealth system that could make a ship completely invisible to every known type of sensor in the galaxy. It did not just hide the ship. It made it so that the space where the ship existed looked exactly like empty space. Light bent around it. Energy signatures vanished. Gravity was masked. A human ship could park itself next to a Valkyrie battle station, and the station would see nothing but stars. Next came the weapons. The Rift engine, the clumsy device that had given humanity FTL travel, was redesigned from the ground up. Dr. Feld, the woman who had invented it, led the team personally. She had not slept more than 4 hours a night since New Svalbard. Her team discovered that the same spacetime distortions used for travel could be focused into a beam of incredible destructive power. They called it the Rift Lance. When fired, it tore a hole in the fabric of space itself. Anything caught in that hole did not explode or burn. It was simply pulled apart at the atomic level and scattered across dimensions. There was no shield in the galaxy that could stop it, because shields were designed to block energy. The Rift Lance did not use energy. It used the structure of reality as a weapon. Then came the Swarm. A young engineer named Kenji Hata, who had lost both parents on New Svalbard, designed the first prototype in his apartment using spare parts. The concept was simple but terrifying. Billions of tiny autonomous drones, each one no larger than a coin, capable of working together like a single organism. They could attach to a warship's hull and disassemble it piece by piece, breaking molecular bonds and consuming the raw material to build more of themselves. A single swarm pod could destroy a battleship in minutes and grow larger from the wreckage. There was no way to shoot them down. There were too many. There was no way to outrun them. They were too fast. There was no way to shield against them. They ate shields too. Finally, there were the ships themselves. 12 of them built in secret inside hollowed-out asteroids scattered across the Sol system. They were called the Erebus class, named after the Greek god of darkness. Each one was 3 kilometers long, ugly and brutal, covered in thick armor plating and bristling with rift lances. They looked like weapons because that is all they were. There was no elegance in their design, no beauty. They were monuments to grief shaped into steel. Captain Yuki Tanaka was given command of the flagship, the ENS Consequence. She was 41 years old, a former cargo pilot with a calm voice and steady hands. She had volunteered for the program on the day it was announced. Her daughter, Mika, had been 7 years old. Mika had been on the Gentle Dawn, the medical ship that carried 400 children. Tanaka did not talk about Mika. She did not need to. Everyone on her crew knew. Everyone on every ship knew someone who had been lost. The fleet was crewed by the grieving, and grief made them precise. Tanaka ran drills every single day. She ran them until her crew could launch fighters in their sleep, until weapons officers could target a moving ship in under 2 seconds, until navigation could execute a rift jump with their eyes closed. She pushed them hard because she knew what was coming, and she knew there would be no second chance. While the fleet was being built, Ambassador Ravat Chandrasekaran played her own role. She remained at the conquered capital, the only human in a city of millions of aliens. She attended diplomatic functions. She smiled at the species that had let her people die. She made polite conversation with Velkari officers who bragged about their conquests without knowing she was listening carefully to every word. She filed reports to the conquered that painted Earth as broken and lost, a species mourning itself to death. And every night in her private quarters, she encrypted the real reports and sent them home through channels no one knew existed. Troop movements, fleet positions, sensor frequencies, shield harmonics, the location of every military installation the Velkari had built in the last century. She was the most dangerous spy in the galaxy, and she did it all with a smile and a glass of wine. 5 years passed. The galaxy continued as it always had. The strong took from the weak. The conquered wrote treaties that meant nothing. The Velkari conquered another species and celebrated with a military parade that lasted 3 days. On the morning of the 5-year anniversary of the New Svalbard massacre, 12 asteroids in the Sol system cracked open simultaneously. The Erebus fleet launched in perfect formation, completely invisible, moving faster than anything the galaxy had ever seen. They made no sound. They sent no signals. They were ghosts made of metal and rage, sliding through the dark between the stars. Ambassador Chandrasekaran was in her quarters when the single-word transmission arrived on her private channel. She read it, set down her glass, and walked to the window. The conquered capital spread out below her, a vast city of crystal towers and floating platforms, beautiful and ancient and utterly unaware of what was coming. Tomorrow, the message said. Chandrasekaran looked at the alien city that had watched her people die and felt nothing but calm. She poured herself a new glass of wine, raised it to the window, and whispered to no one in particular. "You really should have just said sorry." The Velkari homeworld of Karvolta was a fortress. That was not an exaggeration. The entire star system had been turned into a weapon over thousands of years. 3 rings of orbital defense platforms circled the planet, each one carrying enough firepower to crack a moon. 600 warships patrolled the outer boundary at all times. Sensor arrays stretched out for light years in every direction, so sensitive they could detect the heat signature of a single engine at the edge of the system. Deep space mines drifted in clouds so thick that any approaching fleet would have to fight through a wall of explosions before it even reached the first patrol line. The Velkari High Command had designed this system to be unbreakable. In their entire history, no enemy had ever reached Karvolta. No enemy had ever tried. The system was not just defended. It was a statement. It said, "We are untouchable." On the morning of what would later be called the longest day in galactic history, a junior Velkari sensor technician named Vrel was sitting at his station on the outer patrol ring. His shift was boring as it always was. Nothing ever happened at Karvolta. The screens showed empty space in every direction. Stars, dust, nothing. He did not know that 12 human dreadnoughts were already inside the system. They had been there for 6 hours. They had passed through every sensor net, every mine field, every patrol line without triggering a single alarm. The ghost doctrine worked exactly as designed. The Velkari sensors saw nothing because there was nothing to see. The ships were holes in space, pockets of silence moving through the dark with the patience of something that had waited 5 years for this moment. Captain Yuki Tanaka sat in the command chair of the ENS Consequence and watched the Velkari homeworld grow larger on her screen. It was a brown and red planet, harsh and dry, covered in sprawling military complexes and towering monuments to conquest. She could see the orbital platforms, the shipyards where new warships were being built, the communication arrays that linked the Dominion together. She looked at all of it with an expression that showed nothing at all. Her communications officer, Lieutenant Park, turned to her. He was the younger brother of David Park, the colony worker whose final transmission had been played at the Emergency Council meeting 5 years ago. "Captain," he said, "all ships report ready, awaiting your order." Tanaka checked the clock on her console. It read 600 hours ship time. She had chosen the start time carefully. She had chosen everything carefully. "Open a channel," she said. "All frequencies translated into Velkari." The channel opened. Tanaka's voice was broadcast across the entire star system, from the outer patrol line to the surface of the planet itself. Every Velkari heard it. Every soldier, every commander, every civilian. They heard a human voice speaking their language with perfect pronunciation, and it said, "You killed 800,000 of our people in 9 hours. We thought about what a proportional response would look like. Then we decided proportion was a concept for species that had earned our respect. You have not." She paused, then she said, "You have 9 hours." The channel closed, and the Erebus fleet dropped its stealth. 12 ships appeared on every Velkari sensor screen simultaneously, already deep inside the system, already in weapons range of the orbital platforms. The sensor technician Vrel stared at his screen and made a sound that his species made when they were very afraid. It was the last sound he made before a rift lance tore his station apart. The battle began at 600 and it would end at 1500, not because it would take that long, because Tanaka would make it last exactly that long. 9 hours, a mirror, a message. The first 20 minutes belonged to the swarm. The dreadnoughts opened their launch bays and released clouds of silver drones that spread across the system like a living fog. The Velkari Outer Patrol Fleet, 600 warships, was the first target. The drones descended on them in waves. Each drone was tiny, no bigger than a human hand, but there were billions of them, and they worked together with a single mind. They landed on the Velkari hulls and began to eat. It was not a word the Velkari military had ever used to describe a weapon before, but there was no other word for it. The drones broke apart the molecular bonds of the hull plating, consumed the material, and used it to build more of themselves. A warship that had taken 30 years to build was reduced to a cloud of metallic dust in 4 minutes. The crew inside had just enough time to understand what was happening before the walls around them dissolved. The Velkari fought back. They were warriors and they did not run. Weapons batteries opened fire on the drones, but it was like shooting at rain. For every drone destroyed, 100 more were built from the debris. Point defense systems overheated and failed. Shield generators burned out trying to repel things that were too small to shield against. In the first hour, 200 Velkari warships ceased to exist. High Command scrambled the home fleet. 2,000 warships launched from the orbital shipyards and formed a massive battle line between the human fleet and the planet. It was the largest concentration of Velkari military power ever assembled. The Grand Admiral, a decorated veteran named Korvath, stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, and ordered all ships to fire. 2,000 warships fired at once. The combined energy output was enough to crack a planet. The Erebus dreadnoughts took the full barrage without slowing down. Their armor, designed using principles the Velkari could not understand, absorbed the energy and dispersed it harmlessly. Weapon impacts that should have crippled a capital ship left barely visible marks on the human hulls. Tanaka watched the damage reports scroll across her screen. Hull integrity on all 12 ships remained above 97%. "Return fire," she said calmly. The rift lances fired. They did not look like normal weapons. There was no beam of light, no flash of energy. Instead, the space in front of the dreadnoughts simply cracked, like glass breaking in slow motion, and lines of distortion reached out toward the Velkari fleet. Where those lines touched a ship, the ship stopped existing. Not destroyed, not burned, simply removed from reality. The molecules that had made up the hull, the crew, the weapons, all of it was pulled into the fracture and scattered across dimensions that had no name. The Eternal Dominion was the first capital ship to fall. Grand Admiral Korvath had just enough time to see the fracture line reaching toward his bridge before everything went white, and then went nothing. The greatest warship the Velkari had ever built was gone in less than a second, leaving behind nothing but a scar in space that slowly healed itself. The Velkari did not retreat. They could not believe what they were seeing, so they kept fighting. Fresh waves of ships launched from the remaining shipyards. Fighters poured out of carriers by the thousands. Ground-based defense platforms fired upward with everything they had. It made no difference. The human electronic warfare systems blinded Velkari targeting computers. Ships fired wildly into empty space while the real dreadnoughts moved untouched. The swarm continued to spread, eating through the orbital platforms one by one, consuming shipyards that had taken centuries to build. Every hour, the Velkari military grew smaller, and the swarm grew larger. By the 6th hour, the Velkari had lost over 1,500 warships. All 3 orbital defense rings were gone. Every shipyard was dust. The remaining 500 ships fell back to a tight formation around the planet, preparing for a final stand. Tanaka ordered the fleet to hold position. For 30 minutes, nothing happened. The Velkari waited, weapons charged, ready to die fighting. The human fleet simply floated in space and watched them. Then Tanaka opened a channel to the remaining Velkari commanders. "Your military is finished," she said. "Your shipyards are gone. Your orbital defenses are gone. You have 500 ships left and no ability to build more. In 3 hours I can take those too, but I want you to understand something first." She paused. "Look at your planet. Look at your cities. Your homes, your families, they are untouched. We have not fired a single weapon at your world, not one. We could glass your entire planet right now. Every city, every town, every person on the surface. We have the power to do it, and no one in this galaxy would stop us, just as no one stopped you at New Svalbard." The channel was silent. "We are not going to do that," Tanaka said, "because we are not you." In the final 3 hours, the Erebus fleet systematically destroyed every remaining military asset in the Carvolta system. Every warship, every weapons depot, every ammunition store, every military communication array. The swarm ate through it all with mechanical patience. By hour 9, exactly 9 hours after the first Rift Lance had fired, the Velkari Dominion's military capability was completely and totally erased. The planet below was untouched. Civilian power grids still ran. Water still flowed. Children still played in the streets of cities that had no idea how close they had come to oblivion. The only difference was the sky. Where there had once been rings of orbital platforms and fleets of warships, there was now only empty space and silence. Tanaka sent one final transmission. "Your civilians are alive. Your world is whole. Rebuild as something better or do not rebuild at all. That choice is yours." The Consequence and its fleet engaged their rift engines and vanished. The system was empty. The silence they left behind was heavier than any weapon. At the conquered capital, Ambassador Chandrasekharan walked into the Grand Assembly Chamber without an invitation. 4,000 species watched as she placed a small data chip on the central podium. She looked around the room at the representatives of civilizations that had existed for millions of years, and she said 7 words. "I recommend you watch this before speaking." She turned and walked out, behind her. The The chamber erupted into noise, then confusion, then silence as the footage began to play. 4,000 species watched the most powerful military in their sector of the galaxy be dismantled in 9 hours by a species they had written off as dead. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the footage playing on the screen, and even that eventually ended, leaving nothing but the quiet hum of a galaxy that was just beginning to understand how badly it had miscalculated. The footage from Carvolta spread across the galaxy like a disease. Within a day, every species in the Concord had seen it. Within a week, species outside the Concord had obtained copies. Within a month, there was not a single spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy that had not watched the Velkari Dominion, the most feared military force in 1,000 light years, be taken apart like a toy in the hands of an angry child. The reaction was not what anyone expected. There was no outrage, no calls for punishment against Earth, no emergency military summits to discuss the human threat. Instead, there was something the galaxy had never truly experienced before on this scale. Fear. But it was not the simple fear of a powerful weapon. The galaxy had seen powerful weapons before. Elder species had built devices that could destroy stars. The Concord itself maintained a fleet large enough to darken the sky of any world. Raw destructive power was not new. What was new, what kept diplomats awake at night and made military commanders stare at their star maps with hollow eyes, was the combination of 3 things that had never appeared together before. The technology came first. Concord analysts tore apart every second of the Carvolta footage, trying to understand what they were seeing. The results terrified them. The Rift Lance operated on principles that the most advanced species in the Concord could not explain. The Menhara, who had been studying physics for 3 million years, admitted publicly that they did not understand how it worked. The stealth technology was worse. The Velkari sensor network was one of the best in the galaxy, and it had seen nothing. Not a ghost, not a shadow, not a flicker. 12 ships the size of mountains had sat inside the most heavily defended star system in the sector for 6 hours, and the defenders never knew they were there. 5 years. That was what shook them the most. 5 years ago, humanity had been flying cargo ships with engines held together by hope and welding wire. Now they had weapons that made the galaxy's oldest civilizations look primitive. The Concord had spent millions of years advancing slowly and carefully, building on the work of generations. Humanity had jumped ahead of all of them in the time it took to raise a child from infancy to kindergarten. How became the most asked question in the Concord. No one had a good answer. The restraint came second, and it was somehow more disturbing than the weapons. Every species in the galaxy understood violence. Violence was the oldest language in the universe. What they did not understand was violence with a boundary. Every civilization that had ever achieved the level of power Earth had just demonstrated had used it to conquer. It was considered a natural law as reliable as gravity. Power expands. The strong take from the weak. It was the foundation that the entire galactic order was built on. Earth had broken that foundation. They had possessed the power to destroy the Velkari completely, to burn their world to ash and salt the ground so nothing would grow again. The Velkari certainly would have done it if the positions were reversed. Any conquered species would have done it. But the humans had drawn a line between military and civilian, between capability and choice, and they had stopped at that line without hesitation. The conquered did not have a word for this. In the languages of 4,000 species, there was no single term that described the deliberate decision not to use overwhelming force against those who cannot fight back, despite having every reason to do so. In most galactic languages, the concept simply did not exist because no one had ever needed a word for something that had never happened before. The silence came third. After Carvolta, Earth went quiet again. No demands, no territorial claims, no ultimatums sent to the conquered, no application for membership, no declaration of empire. The human fleet returned to Sol space and vanished behind whatever veil of secrecy had hidden them before. Ambassador Chandrasekaran remained at the conquered capital, but she made no statements, attended no sessions, and answered no questions. She simply existed, a polite and smiling reminder of what was waiting in the dark if anyone made the wrong decision. The silence was the worst part. If Earth had made demands, the conquered would have known what to do. Demands could be negotiated, threats could be measured, ambitions could be managed. But silence gave the galaxy nothing to work with. It forced every species to fill the emptiness with their own imagination, and what they imagined was always worse than any real threat could have been. Border conflicts that had raged for centuries suddenly went quiet. Two species that had been fighting over a mineral-rich moon for 300 years signed a peace treaty in a single afternoon. A warlord in the Outer Rim who had been terrorizing shipping lanes for decades voluntarily surrendered to conquered authorities, stating publicly that he did not wish to attract attention from any direction. Weapons budgets across the galaxy were quietly reduced. Military parades were canceled. An entire sector of space that had been a hotbed of piracy became the safest trade route in the galaxy overnight. Nobody said it was because of Earth. Nobody had to. On the Velkari homeworld, the Dominion was tearing itself apart from within. The warrior caste who had ruled for millennia had lost everything that gave them authority. Their fleet was dust. Their orbital fortresses were gone. Their reputation, the thing they valued above all else, was shattered beyond repair. They had been beaten so completely and so publicly that their subject species, the dozens of civilizations they had conquered over the centuries, began to rebel. 3 worlds declared independence in the first month. 12 more followed. The warrior caste tried to maintain control through ground forces, but without a fleet, they could not project power beyond their own planet. The Dominion, which had stretched across 300 star systems, collapsed to a single world in under a year. From the ashes of that collapse, a new voice emerged. A young Velkari named Torek, who had been a minor scholar studying alien cultures, something the warrior caste had always considered a waste of time. Torek was not a fighter. He was thin by Velkari standards, with none of the heavy bone plating that warriors prized. But he had something the warrior caste did not. He had the ability to look at what had happened and tell the truth about it. He stood in the central square of the Velkari capital and spoke to a crowd of thousands. "We were not defeated by a superior empire," he said. "We were punished by grieving parents, and we deserved it." The crowd was silent. Then slowly they began to listen. At the conquered capital, a Menhara analyst named Diyen Ilvrathi had been assigned to study humanity. She was the foremost xenoanthropologist in the galaxy, a scholar who had spent her career studying 10,000 species across millions of years of history. She had analyzed civilizations that built rings around stars, species that existed as pure energy hive minds that spanned entire worlds. She had never encountered anything that truly surprised her. Humanity surprised her. She compiled a dossier that grew larger every day. She studied their history, their wars, their art, their music, their literature. She watched their memorial services for New Svalbard. She read the speeches given by ordinary people at candlelight vigils in cities across Earth. She studied the recordings from the evacuation, the final messages sent by people who knew they were going to die. She listened to a mother singing to her child on a transport ship as the hull breached around them. What disturbed Ilvrathi was not the violence at Carvolta. She had seen violence before from species far more brutal than humans. What disturbed her was the grief. It was everywhere. It was in everything. The entire human response, every weapon, every ship, every tactical decision was soaked in it. The Erebus fleet was not a military force in any way she recognized. It was an expression of loss so vast and so deep that it had been forged into metal and launched at the stars. She began to understand something that the rest of the conquered had missed. Earth had not gone to war. War implied a desire for something, territory. Resources, power. Earth had desired nothing from the Velkari except one thing. They wanted the galaxy to know that the dead had mattered. Then came the transmission. 3 months after Carvolta, Earth sent a single communication to the Galactic Concord. It was not a threat. It was not a demand. It was not a treaty proposal. It was a list. Names: 812,417 names. Every man, woman, and child who had died at New Svalbard. The list took 3 days to transmit at maximum bandwidth. Each name included the person's age, their home country on Earth, and one personal detail. A favorite song, a hobby, a pet's name, a dream they had talked about. At the bottom of the list, a single line: they had names. Diane Elvrathi read every name. It took her 11 days. When she finished, she sat alone in her office for a long time. Then she opened her report, the one that would be read by every leader in the Concord, and she wrote her conclusion. It was a single sentence. Do not provoke this species again. Not because of what they can do, but because of what they choose not to do. She sent the report, closed her terminal, and looked out her window at the stars. Somewhere out there, behind a wall of silence and grief and terrible purpose, 8 billion human beings were waiting to see if the galaxy had learned its lesson. Elvrathi had studied 10,000 species. She had never been afraid of any of them. She was afraid now. 3 years passed before Earth spoke to the galaxy again. When it did not speak with weapons. In the spring of 2195, every species in the Galactic Concord received an identical message through their diplomatic channels. It was short, written in clear and simple language, translated into all 4,000 primary Concord languages with perfect accuracy. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was an invitation. Earth proposed the Sol Accords. The terms were simple enough that a child could understand them. Any species that signed would agree to 4 principles: no wars of conquest against other species, no annexation of developing civilizations, protection of civilian populations during any conflict, and mutual aid when any signatory faced a crisis they could not handle alone. That was it. No complicated legal frameworks, no pages of exceptions and loopholes. No councils of elders who could reinterpret the rules to suit their interests. 4 principles: take them or leave them. The Concord's initial reaction was confusion. They had expected demands. They had spent 3 years preparing for demands. Entire diplomatic teams had been assembled to negotiate with humanity over territorial concessions, technology sharing agreements, and reparation payments. The Concord had assumed because the Concord always assumed that power was used to take things. That was how the galaxy worked. That was how it had always worked. But the Sol Accords did not take anything. They offered something instead. They offered a promise that Earth would stand beside any species willing to treat others with basic decency, not above them, not in front of them, beside them. The elder species of the Concord dismissed it immediately. The Dreth Collective, a hive mind that controlled 200 star systems, called the Accords naive sentimentality from an infant species playing at diplomacy. The Jurathi Federation, a reptilian civilization that had been a major power for 500,000 years, refused to even read the document, stating that they did not accept moral instruction from a species that had existed for less time than their oldest buildings. The smaller species felt differently. The Alani were the first to sign. They were a small, gentle people, bird-like in appearance, with hollow bones and soft voices. Their homeworld sat in a system that 3 different conquered powers had been fighting over for 2 centuries. None of them wanted the Alani. They wanted the mineral deposits beneath the Alani's feet. The Alani had spent generations living under the threat of invasion, watching larger species argue over their world as if they did not exist. When they read the Sol Accords, their ambassador wept in public, something considered deeply shameful in their culture. She signed the document that same day. The Tessari signed next, then the Vone, then the Pelinari, then species whose names most of the galaxy had never bothered to learn, small civilizations that had spent their entire histories being pushed around, conquered, exploited, or simply ignored by the great powers of the conquered. One by one, they read the Accords and saw something they had never been offered before: A choice. A real choice, backed by a species that had proven it could back up its words with action. Within a year, 217 species had signed the Sol Accords. It was not a military alliance. Earth made that very clear. There was no combined fleet, no joint command structure, no mutual defense pact that required military action. It was a moral contract, a statement that said, "We believe these things matter and we will stand by them." The conquered was rattled, not by the accords themselves but by what they represented. For 10,000 years, the conquered had operated on the assumption that the galaxy was a hierarchy, strong species at the top, weak species at the bottom, everyone in their place. The Sol Accords did not challenge this hierarchy with force. They challenged it with an idea, and ideas were far more dangerous than fleets. The crack in the Concord's foundation came from the last place anyone expected. The Ethan were one of the oldest species in the galaxy, a graceful, slow-moving people who resembled tall trees with limbs of woven light. They had been founding members of the Concord 3 million years ago. Their word carried more weight than any fleet. When the Ethan spoke, the galaxy listened. The Ethan ambassador stood before the Grand Assembly and announced that his species was leaving the Concord to join the Sol Accords. The chamber went silent. It was as if the foundation of a building had announced it was leaving. "We are 3 million years old," the ambassador said. His voice was deep and slow, like wind through ancient wood. "In all that time, we have watched species rise and fall. We have watched the strong devour the weak and called it order. We have watched massacres and called them corrections. We have built a civilization of extraordinary age and called it wisdom." He paused. "It is not wisdom. It is cowardice that has grown comfortable. A species younger than our youngest memory has shown more courage in 5 years than we have shown in 3 million. They were hurt, and they chose not to hurt the innocent in return. We were never hurt, and we never once chose anything at all. We simply watched. That is not wisdom. That is the worst kind of failure." He stepped down from the podium and walked out of the chamber. 3 more elder species followed him before the session ended. On Earth, the changes were quieter but no less important. New Svalbard was being rebuilt, not as a military outpost or a symbol of defiance, but as a garden world. The scarred valley where the original colony had stood was planted with trees from every nation on Earth. A wall of white stone was built at the center, and carved into it were 812,417 names, every person who had died. The wall stretched for kilometers, curving gently through the new forest, and people came from across the Sol system to walk its length and read the names. Captain Yuki Tanaka visited the wall on the day it was completed. She had retired from the fleet the year before. She did not attend the ceremony or speak to the press. She came alone in the early morning when the sun was just touching the tops of the new trees. She walked along the wall until she found what she was looking for. Mika Tanaka, age 7, loved drawing pictures of cats. She stood there for a long time. She did not cry. She had done her crying years ago in the silence of her cabin on the Consequence where no one could hear. She reached out and touched the letters of her daughter's name. The stone was warm from the morning sun. She sat down in the grass, leaned her back against the wall and watched the sunrise. Somewhere in the forest, a bird was singing. It was a species that had been transplanted from Earth, something small and brown that had no idea it was on another planet. It just sang because that was what it did. Back at the conquered capital, Ambassador Chandrasekharan was offered the position of Secretary General of the Sol Accords. She refused. When asked why, she said there was a better candidate. She recommended Torek. The suggestion caused an uproar. Torek was Velkari. The Velkari had killed 800,000 humans. How could a Velkari lead an organization founded on the ashes of that loss? Chandrasekharan answered the objections with a patience that came from years of practice. "The whole point of what we did," she said, "was to build something better. That means trusting people to become better. If we cannot do that, then we fought for nothing." Torek was appointed. At his inaugural address, he spoke simply and without decoration, as was his way. "I come from a people who believed that strength was the right to take," he said. "I stand before you today because a species that had every reason to destroy us chose to teach us instead. I do not know if I deserve this trust, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to." The final chapter began at a Concord diplomatic summit in late 2195. It was the first time Earth had been formally invited to address the full assembly. The Grand Chamber was built to hold representatives of 4,000 species, a vast amphitheater of curved stone and floating light. It had hosted the most powerful beings in the galaxy for millennia. It had never been silent the way it was silent when the human delegation walked in. Secretary General Okonkwo led the delegation. He was old now. His hair was white and he walked with the careful steps of a man who knew his body was slowing down. But his eyes were the same as they had been in that dark room beneath Geneva 8 years ago. Clear, steady, unbroken. He reached the podium at the center of the chamber and looked out at 4,000 species. Millions of eyes, in every shape and color imaginable, looked back at him. The chamber was so quiet that the sound of his breathing was picked up by the amplification system. "We did not come to the stars to conquer," he said. His voice was calm. There was no anger in it, no pride, just the steady tone of a man who had carried a heavy thing for a long time and was finally setting it down. "We did not come to be conquered. We came because we looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone else was looking back. We found out you were." He paused. "And then we found out you did not care when our children were burning." The chamber was still, not a sound, not a movement. "So we made sure you would never forget them. That is all we wanted. That is all we have ever wanted. For you to remember that they had names, that they were real, that they mattered. Not because they were powerful or important or useful. They mattered because they were alive, and being alive is enough." He looked around the room one last time. "We are not asking you to fear us. We are asking you to be better. If you can do that, then everything we built, everything we destroyed, everything we lost will have been worth something." He stepped back from the podium. The silence held for a long moment. Then, from somewhere in the upper tiers of the chamber, a single representative stood. Then another. Then a dozen. Then 100. Then 1,000. Species that had nothing in common, species that had fought wars against each other, species that did not even breathe the same atmosphere, rose to their feet one by one until the entire grand chamber was standing. 4,000 species, standing in silence, not out of fear and not out of awe, out of something that had been missing from the galaxy for a very long time, something that humanity, in its grief and its fury and its stubborn refusal to let the dead be forgotten, had somehow given back to the stars. Respect. Outside the chamber, the galaxy stretched on in all directions, vast and cold and full of ancient light. It was not silent anymore, but it had learned, at the cost of 800,000 lives and one species' unbreakable heart, that silence was never the answer. The answer was names. It was always names.